Random Arc Entertainment presents ReD Book 1, The Dark Pale Perspective, written and performed by LASHLEY-JOHNSTONE. Part 2, Infection. Chapter 28, Separation.
The rest of their journey to DC had been comparatively uneventful. Danica was, in a way, surprised at how clear the roads were on their side. No sign of any crisis response units or anything. At least not on this road. Multiple cars with multiple families inside drove in the opposite direction, no doubt in an attempt to escape the nightmare that Danica, Arkham, and Martin were willingly heading for. The sky rumbled above. Arkham stuck his head out one of the windows of the armored vehicle again. "That's got the hallmarks of a massive thunderstorm," he said, slipping his head back through the gap. "But at least the traffic's light." After the incident back in Baltimore, Danica noticed Arkham staring at her at regular intervals, more closely. Her display hadn't puzzled him. It was more like confirmation of his suspicions. Danica had been through quite a lot in a short space of time. She had decided to strike out on her own in her early teens, and had become involved with dangerous people. You'd be surprised who you can run into on the street. Bizarre twists of fate led to gunfights over territory, fistfights, occasionally fighting for her life. Not just fights over literal territory. The internal battle inside her was also constant. On one side, she wanted independence, a life of her own creation, away from her wreck of a family. And on the other, she just wanted a normal life. But something inside her head told her that she was meant for more. It wasn't a religious thing. It was almost physical. The need to keep searching for answers to questions that just kept forming in her head as she grew older. Is there more out there that we are unable to see because of what we are taught to believe? Are there varying levels of consciousness and or reality inaccessible to us because we're living in a conditioned society? Those questions were what drove Danica forward. She wanted the answers to those questions, truly. But they were answers that firstly can take an infinite amount of lifetimes to amass. Danica ignored that first fact. But the second fact was what made her who she was today. The fact that she could never answer those questions properly, truly, while living by the same rules that that same conditioned society that she believed existed set out. The society that was falling apart in front of her eyes at this very moment. But amongst that wreckage, there was something more, something just for her, that she could feel tugging at her soul in ways that her conscious mind was only just beginning to become aware of. After rejoining the I-95 at Arbutus, the traffic became lighter. The other lane, however, the one that led back in the other direction towards Baltimore, was totally jammed up, no doubt due to the panic that was spreading through the city that lay ahead of Danica and the others. She wasn't sure if the whole city would be under quarantine. The Capitol building itself would be, of course, but how long would that last? This was just the first stage, the panic induced by the fear of the unknown. The traffic jam to their left was a representation of that. But the next stage, after the quarantine broke, which, because this was clearly planned, it would, somehow that would be a new kind of fear. If this catalyst, this method of transportation from person to person currently unknown, altered or killed you depending on you, who you were, where you were from, your family tree, what might it do to her? And, worse still in her mind, what might it do to the two partially human beings sitting in the car with her? She looked out the window again. Because of the trees on either side of the freeway, she was unable to see Columbia, a principal city within the Baltimore metropolitan area. It was basically a community that consisted of 10 self-contained villages. What she could see was the thick, rising smoke that floated above the trees to her right. Nowhere was safe now. After passing Columbia, Martin took exit 38A to merge onto MD32 towards Fort Meade, then exit 10C from the Baltimore and Washington Parkway south towards DC, then finally merging onto the US 50 West and New York Avenue Northeast. "I'm worried," said Danica, as they continued down New York Avenue. The clouds above made it feel like early evening, or as if the sun had never rose this morning in Washington. It was truly dark, not helped at all by the pounding relentless rain. The roads out of Washington were almost as clogged as the freeway had been, the only difference the people running in and around it. The gas stations crowded, chaotic and dry, the various hotels on either side closing for business, putting scared guests of varying ages out on the streets, no doubt due to the fear of a possible contagion. Harrison hadn't said, probably intentionally, how the virus travelled from person to person. That meant that they had to head for the source, the Capitol building. "If the virus isn't airborne, and if the quarantine fails, that means we can still get out of this thing and have a look around, right?" Danica looked to Arkham as she said this, and she was trying to hide the eagerness in her facial expression, but decided at the last moment not to bother. There was no way she could go back from this, so she decided she might as well enjoy it. "I would advise against that," said Martin. This time he turned round to face them both. "We don't even know how to scan for this virus. We have no idea whether it's airborne." Danica took another look out of the window on the left-hand side. The rain was striking the ground viciously, and the black clouds above made the sky look as if it didn't want the sun invading its infinite space. It was becoming increasingly difficult to make out what was out there. "We need to get out there." She glanced at Baldwin. "We need a sample from someone who we know is infected, cross-reference that with someone who isn't infected, compare and contrast the results, then figure out which instrument is best suited to track the victim's movements." Arkham nodded. "Well, we have to start somewhere. Heading to the source is all well and good, but it won't mean a thing if we turn up there armed with, well, no information. If we're even right about all this being down to Galen, it could be somebody else entirely," said Baldwin, his eyes now back on the road. "It's him," said Arkham, now leaning in Baldwin's direction. "The way Harrison was in that message. I know the look in his eyes. The speech pattern he was somewhat copying. Even his body language, it's Galen's thing." "Mind control?" Danica queried. No, it's subtler than that. There's a great deal of patience involved," Martin said, suddenly sounding more animated, as if his latest words sparked from a powerful memory, which of course they did. That was the way it was back in training. For both of them. For all of them. "We could still be wrong. This virus could be designed to just kill everyone it infects. I don't trust what Harrison said, whether or not the video was genuine." Danica was leaning forward now. "And what would be the point of that if they, whoever they are, wanted to just kill everyone? Why not blow the city up? That would do it, wouldn't it?" "Not if they wanted to keep the city and country's wealth intact," countered Baldwin. "And a bomb can be diffused, its explosion contained. A virus can slip through all the cracks. It can just wait. Sometimes all you have to do is breathe the air. So you agree that there is an element of patience involved. If this is what your better half was talking about..." "It's not," Arkham said. "He's wrong." Danica was really confused now. "Who are you guys talking about?" "Never mind," Arkham grunted. He didn't look happy. The last time Danica had seen that look on his face was as they were running into the fray back in Baltimore. "Is he coming?" Martin asked. "Or, better yet, are they?" "I expect so." "Who the fuck are these now 2 people?" Danica protested. Arkham spoke slowly. "A colleague of mine will be joining us at some point soon. Not quite sure when. He's a bit funny with time." Arkham was about to carry on speaking, but before he could, a beeping began to sound. A rapid beep, one after the other, increasing in speed. Danica recognized it instantly, and she knew then that she only had half a second to react, because it was the proximity alarm. In the next second there was a blinding flash of light that stunned everyone in the vehicle. Danica was forced to the side as the armor car lifted slightly, as though something had been thrown directly at it. They had entered the city at around 5:30 a.m. Street lights had illuminated their route ahead, but those light sources seemed to be cut off, as though it was some aftermath effect of the blinding flash. "Get your heads down!" shouted Arkham, whose first port of call was to grab Danica and force her to the vehicle floor, then laying on her slightly to make sure she stayed where she was. She just had time to glance out of the window and see all of the surrounding light disappear as she went down. "Shields up!" Baldwin exclaimed. Only a matter of seconds had passed since the vehicle was lifted into the air, and only now did it show signs of returning to the ground. Arkham just had time to grab Danica by the metal belt that she was wearing, lifting her up slightly, then lifting himself up with one arm so that they were both temporarily floating. Then the vehicle hit the ground, thankfully the right way up. Danica grunted as the shock wave reverberated around the interior, making her head spin as she tried to regain control of her breathing. She had taken a sharp breath in when she had felt the force of whatever had sent the vehicle skyward, and had not let out air since. As she exhaled, she shook the blurriness out of her eyes and regarded the state of the room around her. She was still swaying from Arkham's grip, and so facing straight down. She lifted her head to bring the front of the vehicle into view. She could see that Martin had been sent flying backwards by the blast, and was now lying on his back, staring upward. His eyes were wide and alert, which brought Danica a faint sense of relief. "I'm gonna drop you back down," whispered Arkham. Danica was now conscious of the fact that she had to keep quiet, even though all she wanted to do was scream out in shock. Not because she was scared. She wasn't. Danica tried to nod her head to signal to Arkham that she had heard what he had said, but it was surprisingly difficult given the way she was hanging. Arkham gradually let her go, almost counting down at the same time as loosening his fingers one by one. Once Danica had herself righted, now sitting down properly and taking cover below the right-hand passenger side window, Arkham too dropped down, making no sound whatsoever. "Marty," he said, quietly, and with no sense of urgency. "Oh, good," replied Baldwin, raising one of his thumbs in the air without looking back. Danica looked around her. When she had first entered, a few hours ago, the interior had been well lit, bathing in the light of the various screens. Upon impact, everything had gone dark, and now all Danica could see was the colour red. Although she couldn't identify the source of it, this brought her mind back to Baldwin's place in Wilmington. ReD. Stage 2. "Everyone stay still. That was a calculated shot," Arkham whispered, making his way to the window beside Danica and peering out. "Anything?" asked Danica, lowering the frequency of her voice. Arkham stared out of the window for several long seconds, then took a deep, slow breath. "Not that I can see." He stopped. Danica could almost see his ears prick up. "What is it? What's out there?" hissed Danica. Arkham didn't say anything. He just kept staring, his senses almost becoming one with the outside. Finally, he said, "We need to get out of here. Can you get the power back on?" He was looking at Martin now. Martin shook his head. "Not without clearing the area first. I'll need to go outside and assess the damage." Arkham nodded, then looked at Danica. "Stay here, okay?" "Not okay," said Danica, her voice rising slightly. Arkham raised his hand to signal to her to quiet down. "I'm not staying in here. What if whatever shot at us fires again? He might hit the tank and blow us all to hell." "That's not going to happen, Danny," said Arkham, using a shortened version of her name that he'd never used before. This somehow gave Danica comfort. "You just need to stay put. I'll go take a look, and while I'm doing that, you can help Marty get the power back on. Once we do that, we can retaliate." Danica didn't argue. There was no point now. He had made up his mind, and if she was honest with herself, she'd much rather be in an armoured vehicle fiddling with wires than slowing Arkham down out there, even if she did know how to take care of herself. "Just be careful," she said. She touched his shoulder. He looked in the direction of her hand, smiled, and stood up. Then he looked at Baldwin. "Look after her," he said, before making for the rear exit. Then he turned upon shutting the door from the outside, catching Danica's eye. "Hell, you look after him." The door closed. Danica joined Martin, who had now moved back into the driver's seat of the vehicle. She sat beside him, cradling her head in her hands. "He'll be back, right?" she said, slowly, and with a lot more confidence than she felt. Martin turned to face her, not a hint of humour on his round face. "I expect so."
Chapter 29. Crime Scene City, Part 2. Arkham.
After Arkham had exited the back of the car, he searched in the darkness for the hidden compartment which held equipment that could be useful in situations like this one. Some as innocent as a torch, others as sinister as synthetic poison darts that were developed by Biocide in the late 90s. These poison darts were one of many government-funded projects, not publicized, of course, to be used by people who would rather be referred to as information extractors than torturers. Arkham Void wasn't a man who enjoyed torturing people. He wasn't a man who enjoyed much of anything. But he had found himself in certain situations that warranted extreme interrogation. He also consoled himself with the fact that those situations had produced results and led to the matter being resolved, or important, vital information extracted. And it wasn't as if these torture victims were exactly holier than thou either. Some of them had been child killers, rapists, serial murderers, who commit act after act of pointless emotional tyranny. But, at the same time, some hadn't. The poison darts may not be immediately useful at this current time, but Arkham knew that whatever was going on here was going to get a hell of a lot worse before it got better, which meant he had to be prepared for every eventuality. He ducked down and accessed the sliding mechanism hidden on the underside of the back right wheel arch, turning it anti-clockwise and pushing it up with the palm of his hand. The protective copper and aluminium covering dropped down to hang at a 90-degree angle. Looking around him, he could see how far back the armoured car had been pushed by the mysterious blast. He knew that he probably shouldn't hang around, since he had no idea whether the shooter still had him or the car in their sights. The benefit of the nature of the blast, however, was that it had caused a blackout, at least in the city centre, and thanks to the dark and unrelenting clouds above, pissing down on him, it could have been midnight. That was good. That gave him cover, room to move. The armoured car had been struck head-on by an electromagnetic pulse. Luckily, though, the car was basically a mobile Faraday cage. Although the electrics cut off inside the vehicle, the damage would only be temporary. He was confident that Martin would be able to give the thing a jump start with Danica's help, once they had determined the components that were actually affected. Arkham rustled around in the compartment, trying to locate what he was looking for. He had a habit of stockpiling Martin's best prototypes for himself, occasionally using them in the field and hoping that he wouldn't notice, which of course he always did. 20 seconds of searching later, he found what he was looking for. A pair of X-ray enhanced night lenses that you strapped around your head like a pair of mechanical swimming goggles. They could see through objects, buildings, people, and provide him with detailed information about mechanical and biological structures and states. EMPs are designed to knock out electrical equipment, ranging from a simple wristwatch to an entire defense system. Some EMPs were designed to incapacitate electrical goods for an allotted period of time, or take them out indefinitely. Arkham made a calculated guess that whoever was behind this was attempting to break the quarantine of the capital by shutting it down completely, turning off everything, so that the capabilities of the containment became weaker, forcing people outside into the open. People who, if they were still alive, would be eager to get out of the building. The infected. But that begged the question, who had released the virus inside the capital? Or, more accurately, who had delivered it prior to the president's address? When Arkham had watched Doc Harrison's speech, if you could call it that, it was more like a rant. There was an arrogance to him, almost as if he knew that he was only the starting point, ground zero, and Harrison clearly hadn't released the virus personally. There was nobody else of importance in the White House apart from Harrison himself. Therefore, releasing a virus in the White House would have killed a grand total of 2 people. He had made the speech from the White House, revealing the target location as the Capitol. Someone else was working with him. Or at least, they may be working for the same person. They could just be puppets after all. The goggles kicked into life and Arkham scanned the area around him. He could hear screaming coming from about 200 meters ahead. He made sure that he had everything securely strapped to his body, then broke into a run, knowing if he was going to start moving it would have to be fast. The first job he had was determining the source of the blast, and he had to do this while moving at an insane pace, thinking and running to avoid being spotted. It seemed that most of the civilians, realizing that the traffic would be immovable, had fled on foot, away from the danger, dispersing and hiding, for now at least. How far did the blast have to travel before impact? It definitely wasn't a case of push button equals blackout. It was more like that blast had come from a weapon of some kind, a gun maybe, a sniper. He rewinded his mind back to the moment just before the impact. Although Arkham had been looking at his monitor when he told Danica to scan the surrounding buildings for life signs, the monitor to his left, which he remembered being able to see out of the corner of his eye, had live camera footage filmed by tiny cameras fixed to the armoured car's exterior. Because the car had quite a large yet camouflageable antenna that was mostly used for surveillance sweeps and close proximity voice print matches, Arkham had affixed a couple of those miniature cameras to the antenna so that they would be high enough to film the car from above and beyond. There was also another camera fixed to the metal bars that separated the antenna from the roof. Arkham had anchored that one to point towards wherever the car was headed. He remembered noticing that camera feed on his monitor as the flash of light occurred, but after pausing his train of thought at that exact moment, and zooming in on the origin point of the blast, Arkham slowed, looking directly up now. The road they were on led to Capitol Hill, but before the city centre plunged into total blackness, he remembered seeing some sort of warehouse-type building with wire mesh windows on the right-hand side of the road. Through his goggles, he could now see those same windows, looming up above him from a distance in the darkness. And that was when he heard the muffled sound of a man screaming again. Putting that to one side for a second, he lined up his position to where he thought the origin point of the blast was most likely, using the telescopic sights on one of his elaborate handguns to help him, along with the goggles' zoom and enhance function. The screaming was coming from inside that very warehouse, bottom floor. Arkham guessed it could be the security guard, seen as the warehouse's perimeter was also surrounded with wire mesh fencing. "Bad night to be on duty," he muttered to himself. Arkham could see that the best way to get a good vantage point on a building like that was either from one of the top windows or from the rooftop itself. This was a complicated, controlled explosion. In Arkham's case, that usually spelled professional. You didn't tend to see gangland thugs waving around EMP grenades unless they were trying to sell them to the highest bidder. No, this was meant as some sort of deterrent, a warning shot that maybe went further than intended. They were in perfect proximity to Capitol Hill for an EMP blast, so setting it off anywhere around this area would have been effective enough. Maybe they only intended to disable the car, but that would mean that the shooter had been waiting for it to come into view. Someone knew they were coming. Maybe this was connected to the virus, but not directly. There were so many questions buzzing around Arkham's head. If they were targeting the car directly, maybe the blackout was the result of some sort of overpowered ricochet. The blackout may have been an accident caused by them. At the very least, he had to work out where the blast came from. Arkham needed answers, and at that moment the best lead he had were those shouts of terror. The whole area had been silent apart from those screams. The screams were new. And in Arkham's experience, new was good.
Chapter 30. The Screams of the Average Man.
The blackness faded to grey as security guard Carl Jenkins flickered open his eyes. He was upside down. That much was clear. Hanging there, suspended, unable to move, unable to speak, the blood rushing to his head, which was throbbing incessantly. He could hear something that made him shiver. Laughter. He didn't know where it was coming from, but he knew it was close by. He wasn't alone. He couldn't be. Someone had clearly knocked him out and tied him up, maybe. He tried to call out when he noticed that he couldn't open his mouth. He could move his lips, but it was almost as if his mouth was clamped shut, taped shut. He twitched his lips. There was no familiar stinging sensation of sweaty skin against adhesive material. His mouth was just closed. His brain called to mind a scene from the first Matrix movie, one of his favourites, when the agents clamped Neo's mouth shut to induce fear and panic, submission. Carl understood that fear now. Even if calling out was pointless, he would at least like to have the option. As the laughter drew closer, Carl began to see a humanoid shape in the dark pale light, almost sauntering towards him. Next the teeth, then the eyes, the dark pale eyes. Carl's body began to shake uncontrollably, with fear and confusion.
I see you're awake and ready to listen. Good. I was worried that you might stay sleeping for eternity. Might have been the better option, to be honest with you, depending on your perspective. And that's what this is all about. Oh. Yeah, I see your mind's on the delicate side right now. It makes the visuals slightly more real. Real to you, anyway. But I'm sorry to say that the aftermath won't be pretty. And it will be permanent. But, as you're a man who doesn't have much else to live for, don't look at me like that. I just know things. I thought it would only be polite to give you a glimpse of where you've regularly thought about going. A sneak preview, if you will, of the world beyond this one. One of them, anyway. My world. Sort of. Now, as you can tell, you're unable to speak, which, trust me, you'll thank me for. The last person I did this to screamed until his own ears and gums started to bleed. And, I suppose, if I'm going to alter your life, or alter your death, I should do you the honour of making sure your brains stay where they're supposed to be, considering you're upside down. We don't want blood trickling over your third eye, do we? Blurring all the visions?
Carl shook his head vigorously. Then he pondered the latter part of the sentence and began to cry.
Of course we don't. Oi!
The man flicked Carl's forehead.
Enough with the frowning. You need to relax your beliefs, mate.
Now, he placed his hands gently on Carl's quivering lips.
I will return your speech when we're done, but for now, just listen.
And with that, the man with the dark pale eyes, the dark pale smile, the dark pale skin, placed one gloved hand on Carl's head, linking their minds together, kneeling as he did so, his knuckles inches away from the cold, grey concrete floor. The link was now active.
When ignorance dies, cognizance kills. Just as there are different types of life, there are different types of death. You live in different ways, just as you die in different ways. Your heart lives, then it dies. Your spleen lives, that's an example, then it dies. Need I go on? Of course, resuscitation is a thing that exists in this world, but it rarely happens of its own accord. The two simple words charging and clear usually have to be uttered before any kind of heart returns to the rhythm it was born to dance to. That, or someone frantically beating your chest a specific number of times until it decides to rise again. Or doesn't. You can't really alter the natural rhythm of someone's heart without some kind of side effect, usually a negative one, by the way. However, positive side effects do also exist, as does positive death. Because as you should know by now, positivity is a relative concept. You're in a nightmare and I'm having fun. Let's look at this from a different angle, because I'm all about altering perspective. It's kind of my hobby. I may not be human, or not as human as I used to be. I'm what they being the ones who made me, would call a half-breed. The kinder term would be cross-species, a being with both human and somewhat alien DNA. All I know is that I'm more half something than I am full anything. Just as there are different types of human DNA, such as the difference between one human with Neanderthal DNA and one without, there are different types of alien species, subspecies, and cross-species. However, there are more obvious variants both physically and mentally. But all of that will become clear in time. Or it won't. Either way, I don't think you're ready to know. You're not ready to see. Not all of you. Not yet. You are, Carl, because I said so. And we're on the clock, as you guys say. To be honest, it'd be nice to be standing on a big clock all the time. Like, actually on the clock. I'd love that. Anyway, yes, different dimensions do exist, and no, you are not the only intelligent life in existence. The universe is far too complicated for that to be the case. It's an impossible equation, an unsolvable riddle. Most complex equations require preparation, just as many questions need answered before the ultimate one is asked. Some refer to the ultimate question as the God complex, but we have since moved beyond that. Humans are doing the same in present times, whatever the hell that means. They're just going the long way around. Just look at the love-hate relationship God has had with humans throughout history. Your history, not ours, not mine. To you, and I use that word in a plural and historical sense, God was almost everything 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, because you understood almost nothing, for the vast majority at least. And now, whatever that means, God, as a concept, as an idea, is just hidden in the shadows of the things you don't understand. And, like God, my people are hidden in the unknown. Thousands of years ago, due to what we called dimensional retroclosure, and you are nowhere near ready to know what that is, it was impossible for us to cross over onto your plane of existence or communicate with the human race within their dimension. That didn't last forever, of course, nothing does, but for the longest time it was impossible. But somebody figured out how to break down the barriers. That someone, whoever they weren't doing it in the name of war or personal gain. They were doing it in the name of discovery, of progress, of knowledge. And, like any race of people, there were some amongst them who would seek to use this knowledge to accomplish their own ends. A group of people who would seek to conquer, to rule. A mostly ugly congregation of violence that sought power. Knowledge is power, but the kind of power you obtain depends on how you use that knowledge. And when you have the wrong person at the head of a political system, because yes, we all have them, a system intricately infiltrated by political nepotism, lateral thinking, and a dash of imagination, bad decisions can be made that can lead to further mistakes. You know that, right? And as time went on, this wrong person, let's call him Galen, decides to experiment on members of the human race, secretly, of course. His method of experimentation was much subtler by human standards. He would create a virus using a specific type of DNA that would infect and alter the human fetus and begin to change it throughout the pregnancy, all the while undetectable to the carrier or today's human scanning apparatus. The mama may have more morning sickness than usual, but that's virtually the only difference, at least until the wee one is born. Galen's a smart guy. You know you're a genius when you can learn how to hide altered DNA within its own genetic codes. The genetic organisms latch onto the heart and or the brain developing into parasitical organisms. Over a 9-month period, of course. Once the child is born, the heart begins to beat for itself. The brain begins to think for itself. And that is where the fun begins. Those parasites give you hell, pushing you to the brink, and then suddenly pulling you all the way back, becoming symbiotic, becoming one with your body. It nearly killed you, and if you had that language at that young an age, you would go from cursing it to thanking it within a matter of hours. Suddenly you're okay. Different, aye, but okay. Galen comes in, gives the baby a kiss, and threatens any witness or mama on pain of death not to breathe a word about what they have witnessed until the time is right. And he is the one who decides when the time is right. That done, he sends the child home to live a normal life, not forever, but long enough that by the time he comes to collect the child, he or she will be fully developed in a physical and mental sense, developed enough to see what you're not ready to see. That just happens to be 17 years after birth. Ish. That's when my friend and I were taken to be experimented on further, in different but similar ways. It wasn't the most positive time in my life, but Galen's months or maybe even years of experimental brain surgery put everything in perspective. Literally, in my case. The defection is a story for another time. But my current perspective is this. We have to stop Galen, and we have to do it together. And as I've mentioned, I don't think you're ready to know about us. But Galen clearly does. And he's the one with the real power. He wants everyone to be afraid. And what's more, he wants everyone on their knees before him. Gross. In my opinion, Galen is his own god, and his own complex. And someone who has real power and a god complex seems unbeatable, especially since he's gone down the route of maximum effectiveness by the way of a deadly cell-altering virus. Did you know about that? Anyway, we only have pieces of the puzzle. And the only way we will be able to finish it is by asking the man himself. Nobody knows the endgame apart from him. Out there on the streets, there is nothing but panic and bloodshed, and why shouldn't there be? You don't know why some of your loved ones, if you have any, are turning into monsters that suddenly want to kill you, and some of your enemies aren't. It almost doesn't seem fair how much you don't know. But you've been conditioned to believe so many things that aren't what they really are. The human ego trumps all, Carl. Revelations like this are difficult to comprehend, but that doesn't make them any less true. Let me tell you something. Yes, you. This is a reality check. And the reality is, if you want to live, your ego is going to have to die. The dark pale man removed his hand from Carl's head and placed his dark pale skull against Carl's tear and sweat-stained forehead. Think of it as 7 tabs of acid and a lot of bats. With that, he stood up, and with a dismissive wave of the hand, Carl's screaming began. The images would never leave. The truth would never leave. And it was definitely going to hurt. As the dark pale man headed for the door at the other side of the room, a door that led up the stairs, he said, "Ego death, eh? Ain't it a thing?" Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a fellowship to go break up. He stopped and spun round, witnessing the screaming, average man writhing in agony on the floor. "Oh, that reminds me, you don't have a rocket launcher handy, do you? I know that I already took your car, but..." The screaming continued, the drops of blood beginning to form. "Don't worry. I'm sure you've got a lot on your mind at the moment.
He turned then, heading for the open door.
I guess I'll just have to improvise.